Welcome everyone to the Golden Gate Raptor Observatory Molt Academy. My name is Beth Womack. I've been with the GGRO for some time in many different roles: intern, hawk watcher, bander, day leader. I'm currently in a much snowier and colder place than you guys, but I get to join you because of Zoom. And I'm really excited tonight because tonight we're going to talk about advanced molt, which is one of my very, very favorite topics. And one of my very favorite people, Siobhan Ruck, is going to be our instructor tonight. As we get going, I want to remind everyone of the mission of the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy, which is to preserve the Golden Gate National Parks, enhance the park visitor experience, and build a community dedicated to conserving the parks for the future. And I want to remind also everyone of the mission of the Golden Gate Raptor Observatory, which is the preservation of California raptor populations through scientific research, outreach, and community involvement. And we honor the Ramaytush, the Muwekma, the Ohlone, and the coastal Miwok peoples, who are the first residents and caretakers of these parklands, and who continue to guide the Conservancy in its preservation of natural spaces. Mary, was I muted? I didn't think I was.
I hear you.
You guys got me?
Yeah.
Okay, so before we start,
I've got it here.
Just some logistics, please. Unlike me when I'm introducing everything, please stay on mute during Siobhan's talk. Feel free to add in questions. We're going to tackle them mostly at the end, and it will help us a lot if you put question before your question in the chat. And we are recording both this class and the chat. And last thing, I get to introduce Siobhan, which Alan helped us write a better, a longer introduction and biography of Siobhan, and she hates this. She really does. So I'm going to read it all to you. Okay, so Siobhan Ruck, if you don't know her already, is a powerhouse volunteer with the GGRO and has been with us since 1993. She's been a bander, a docent, and a reliable and awesomely creative doer of stuff in every aspect of the GGRO. You might know Siobhan from the dozens of drawings and illustrations she has donated for use in the Raptor Passage, the Pacific Raptor Report, and adorning the covers and insides of GGRO season summaries from 1995 through 2019. She also is on some of our t-shirts. So I bet you some of you guys have Siobhan t-shirts too.
Vintage.
Siobhan's GGRO artwork led her to her illustrating and partnering with ornithologist Peter Pyle on the North American Bird Identification Guide Part 2, which is used by banders nationally and is an international model for assessing bird age and molt. This project with Peter provided Siobhan with a unique and in-depth learning experience in all things molt related. Siobhan is my molt mentor and molt guru. She still gets text messages from me late at night when I have questions about it. And she's always so kind about asking and starting conversations. So I'm going to push it over to Siobhan, who's going to talk to us about molt.
Molt. Okay, you got that screen, right? Okay, it disappears on me whenever I switch over. So hi. Just kind of reiterating what Beth said. If you have a question, please put it in the chat. I promise I'm leaving lots of time for questions later, but with this topic, it's really easy for me to go off on a tangent. They experienced this when we were doing a run through. So we'll save questions till later so that we can actually get through it. Okay, real quickly. Do this thing. Why is it not advancing for me? Okay, it got carried away. I hate technology sometimes. Okay, a quick recap of the previous weeks. The first week, Lynn and Blaine spoke about molt in general. Why do birds molt? It's because they need to keep their feathers in top condition to be able to do the things they do and to have shelter from the world. So they've got to constantly replace them. And Mary, when we were talking about it, gave a great example, talking about how they paint the Golden Gate Bridge end to end, and then they just start all over and do it again. And that's kind of what birds are doing with their feathers. Why do we care? It's because molt can help us determine a bird's age more specifically, which helps us understand longevity. It will also support other observations that we might make about the birds, things like breeding status, migration status, environmental factors where they're living. So we can learn a lot from molt. We can also learn how to obsess. The second week, Shannon reviewed second year birds and talked about molt charts, the 3 different types of molt charts that the banders use. And hawk watchers, I apologize in advance if this seems kind of bander centric sometimes, because that's where I come from. But I'm going to try to make it things that you can usefully do in the field too. Anyway, Boodio molt charts, accipiter molt charts, and the so-called generic, but it's for the very non-generic harriers and falcons. But you can also use it if you have had a great day and you run out of Boodio molt charts. Age codes, there's a lot more to come about this in just a minute. But one little caveat that I want to make before I go further in the talk is all discussions of age here assume that it's happening on today's date. All the different age classes, the birds advance an age class on January 1st every year. And I don't want to get into going back and forth saying, but if this was January 2nd, this would be the bird's age. Okay. Staffelmauser molt pattern and our second year after second year hawks. Molt is not random. You learn this pattern, the way the feathers are replaced, and this pattern holds for Bootios, accipiters. I think it's essentially true for harriers. We don't catch eagles, but if we had an adult eagle, it would follow the same pattern, just more slowly. So it's important to learn this pattern. And there is one group of raptors that we trap that don't have the pattern. That's the falcons. I will talk about that a little bit at the end. Age codes that are used by the banders for the raptors. HY equals hatch year. That's a bird that's all juvenile plumage. Easy peasy. Second year, what happens when the bird becomes an adult? It doesn't drop all of its feathers at once. That would leave it extremely vulnerable. It gradually replaces them. So during that second year of their life, they've got a mix of juvenile and adult feathers. You won't see that after the second year. After second year means it's got a mix, and what I should say is it's got a mixture of juvenile and mostly adult plumage. The juvenile feathers are older and worn. The adult feathers are nice and new. And after second year bird shows old and new plumage, but both the old and the new are adult plumage. After hatch year is a more general term. It's always correct for any adult plumage bird that we have. It's just not as specific. And we use that when we don't see any old feathers on the bird. And it happens surprisingly often with small birds, especially like Sharpies, especially, but accipiters in general, it's common enough to see a bird with no retained feathers. There's one odd thing unknown, and that's when you can't confirm if you're looking at adult or juvenile plumage. And the reason for that is that kestrels molt their body feathers in the fall of their first year. So if you see a kestrel who's got an adult plumaged body, you don't know for sure if it's this year's kid who's still got the rest of its plumage as juvenile, or if it's a bird that's 5 years old. So you have to age them as unknown. However, if you have a kestrel who's still wearing juvenile plumage, you're back up to HY, you know that it's got all juvenile plumage, it's a kid. This one red feather here, this is an example of adventitious molt. When a bird loses a feather at a certain amount of time after they leave the nest, there's a hormonal trigger, but it's pretty soon after they leave the nest. If it loses a feather, the replacement grows in as an adult feather or the next age class that they're going into for something that has multiple years. So if you see an otherwise juvenile red tail with one tail feather in September, it just got in a fight with its nest mate or something like that. It's not a second year bird. Okay, I'm going to show you this part on a juvenile just because it's easier to see. It's really important for you to be able to tell the primaries from the secondaries in their wings. The reason for this is there are 10 primaries, 12 secondaries. A bird that's older, molting, could be an active molt and missing a feather. So if it dropped number 6 or number 7 here, and you're trying to find primary 1 to start your molt chart, and you count back 10 feathers, it's going to take you to secondary 1. So you need to know the actual difference between the types of feathers. The primaries have a straighter shaft, and they sort of point away from the body. And especially right here in the zone where you could have some confusion in counts because of missing feathers, you can see this is really kind of swooping out like that. Secondaries have a more curved shaft, and the curve drags back toward the body. So you can really see the difference in shape right there. Important to pay attention. If you're holding the bird, if you give just a little nudge to the wing joint, right up there, you can actually see the planes of the primaries and the secondaries sort of separate a little bit. So that's another way if you have any doubt about a feather. Staffelmauser molt pattern. This is the key to understanding all aging. So the molt centers, that's where they call the starting point of the molt, is in the primaries, it's primary number 1, P1. In the secondaries, there are multiple centers. There's P1, there's P5, or P1, the way the molt moves out to P4. Then there's P5, which is going sort of simultaneous with 1, moving out to 8. And then the last group starts at 12 and goes down to 9. So you've got 3 different molt centers in the secondaries. And so this shows the first and the last feather in each sequence. The last feather or feathers in each sequence is the least likely to have enough energy to get molted, most likely to be retained. So out here, you probably get as far as number 7. These ones get retained. And Shannon showed us a bit of that last time. So with the second year hawk, this would be a molt chart. This would be a really typical one that you'd see. I'm doing just the top part of it for right now. But we note the new feathers and the old feathers with an N or an O. If a feather was still growing, like right here, you would put a number down to indicate what percentage of the overall length it's grown. So 0.7 to say that it's 70% grown. And you would see 1, 2, 3 molted, but 4 is retained juvenile feather. It would again look shorter. That's how you know it. 5, 6 ran out of steam before it got to 7. So actually these 2 were retained in that tract. From 12 to 9, 9 was retained. On this side, it's a very typical retained 4, 8, 9, and then these outer primaries. And they usually are pretty good about retaining their whole tail every year. By the way, all these, just assume I'm talking red tail unless I say otherwise. Okay, I find it harder to follow just a little N's and O's. So I took a pen and colored in. These are all the new feathers. The blank ones are the retained juvenile feathers. So it gives you a better sense of seeing that wave move through there. And I have to say, if you're trying to teach yourself more about molt, try coloring in a thing like this and figure out your progression across there. Color in the feathers one at a time as they're going to molt. But now you can see more where these feathers come together to be left behind. Okay, now bird made it through its second year. There was an abundance of ground squirrels. It's happy. It's going to start molting again in the same places, P1, S1, S5, S12, but it's also picking up where it left off before because those retained juvenile feathers are getting pretty ratty by now and need to be replaced. So number 8 is going to molt roughly the same, primary number 8 is going to molt roughly the same time as primary number 1. Primary number 2 is going to molt, and then 9 is going to go at the same time. So you're going to see them moving together in tandem out the wing. In the secondaries, S4 molts around the same time as S1, so and so. The remaining feathers will be molted as much or as little as they can spare the energy. Usually in the 3rd year, a lot of these guys are trying breeding for the first time, so they may not have a lot of energy to spare. Okay, so now this is last year's 2nd year red tail up here in the corner. Now this is the following year. This is actually kind of typical-ish for a 3rd year bird for it to do about like this. Starts at number 1 and moves outward. At the same time 1 is starting, 8 is starting, and it's moving outward there. Just like last year, it didn't have enough energy to do all of these primaries, so this wave just kind of got stopped here, and these 2 feathers from last year got held over for another year. In the secondaries, number 1 secondary and number 4 both went around the same time, and then number 2 didn't quite get to number 3. Likewise, here in these secondaries, on this wing, kind of similar stuff. It did manage to get number 9 done, but it only got 7 of its primaries replaced instead of 8. So you got 3 held over for the following year. Following me so far? Good. Okay, then things start to get more mixed up. Okay, so that was our nominal 3rd year bird. Following year, oops, God, why does it only do that when I don't want it to? Okay, following year, these feathers here, wait, I'm okay, these are the retained juvenile feathers, the 6 and 7. Okay, 6 and it starts at 1, but it also starts at 6 and 7. It's got to get those out of the way. And it's starting to get a little random in here. It's still starting at the molt centers, but the amount that it's replacing varies a little bit. In this wing, same thing, starts at 1, and then that 5, 6, and 7 had been held over from the second year plumage, so it's got to replace those, but it didn't quite have enough. This is what we would call a very old feather, and I'll show you some examples later, but it's even more worn. It'll have to get replaced next year, but you start seeing this in older birds. They really do hold some over. It can kind of afford to do this on this feather because these outer primaries have a lot more melanin in them to give them strength, so it can hold up reasonably well. Okay, now there's last year's bird. It had held over 4 and 5 and 8, 9, 10. So now it had to get 4 and 5 replaced. It started with 1 and 2, but it really had to do 4 and 5. And then it needed to do 8, 9, 10, but it kind of ran out of steam there. So 10 got retained, and that happened on both wings. But what you're also seeing, because of these stops and starts, you're getting shorter waves of 2 to 3 feathers, and you're getting more of them. So now we see like one little wave that goes there, one little wave that goes there, one little wave that goes there. So that's 3 waves, and that's telling you that bird has definitely been around a few years. And same thing is happening here. We keep going, and at this point, some of these waves are only 1 feather, and you get to a situation where it's essentially alternating colors. It really starts to look random. If you could track each bird each year, you could see that it had followed a logic all of the time. But when you're just picking this bird up and looking at it for the first time, you have no idea how many times it's been through the process. But just the fact that it's such a mess, and it's really almost every other feather, that tells you that this bird has, in all likelihood, molted several times, many times. Okay, enough of that. If hawks were color coded like that, it would be super easy to age them. They are not. So let's look at some real life ones, and besides, they're prettier, right? Yes. Okay. Real live bird number 1. You can see this is a new feather. It's got a really nice black shaft. Versus these older feathers, the feather itself is kind of browner and faded. The shaft is kind of faded and brown and beige rather than black and gray. The edge of this one, it still has a really nice crisp edge, a little bit of white even on the sides. The edge is getting a little bit more frayed. The white is wearing away. One of the things here that you can see is these 4 feathers were all probably replaced the year before, and it probably took a period of a couple of months for 4 feathers to grow in there. The oldest of them, you can see the fading, the difference in fading just over those period of months there. Then we get a brand new feather, another brand new feather, another new one. Then we get an old one. You can see the beigey, browny colors there. And this has a little bit of the brown thing. It's harder to see from this angle. Here, this looks a little bit older. I don't know if it's last year's feather or if it's just this year's molted early, and now this one is so fresh next to it that you can't, that you really see the contrast. This one looks like it could even be what we call, a very old feather. The ends are really frayed. The sides get this scalloping because the melanin in the feathers gives it strength. So the lighter stripes wear away faster than the dark stripes, and you get this really noticeable edge sometimes. So you can see these 3 feathers are older. It kind of looks like this feather and this feather are older than the one in the middle. So that makes me think another reason why these might be very old. Some nice new ones, some more shaggy old ones. This looks kind of really old, but maybe this bird just had some feather mites, who knows? And similar pattern on the other wing. The primaries are actually exactly the same molt, nicely mirrored. The secondaries, this one is 2 new ones, and then another very old one, new, old, etc. Look at that beautiful eye. Here's the molt chart we did for it, noting the new, old. I think that one that I said was really very old was maybe some of these other ones should have been. Oh, wait, it skipped the tail, didn't it? Oh, no, I guess it didn't. And these are the other things that we fill out on a molt chart. There were questions that lead us to aging. Are the retained secondaries shorter than the new feathers on this bird? No. Is the subterminal band thinner than the old secondaries on this bird? No. If the answer to those questions had been yes, these would have been juvenile feathers, and that would have said that it was a second year bird, as it was, because they're all the same pattern, just some of them are new, some of them are old. This is an after second year bird. I think the asterisk after the age of ASY there is because I probably made a note saying there were multiple waves of molt, and so probably an older bird. Okay. This is just because I'm a weirdo. A few years ago, I took a nice spread wing and just did the exercise of labeling it. I think I was going to use it for one of our molt classes there, but it makes it pretty easy to see what's new, what's old. I talked about the fraying, and the wear at the edge of the feather. One thing to be careful not to confuse is these birds did just come out of a net, and sometimes, and they've been in a can and stuff like that. So sometimes you're going to see a little bit of mussed up edge on the feather, but the white's still there. I mean, it's a basically crisp feather. It's just been messed up a little bit by, being trapped. So don't use that one thing in isolation to say, oh, that's an old feather. So, okay. And I had a note. Oh yeah, and the one other thing that's fun about this. So this is a wave because this is new. So that's the start of a wave. And then there's some old ones. Here's the start of another wave. So that's 2 waves, then some old ones, then a third wave of new ones, and then an old one. And there's another new feather. So this bird has 4 waves of molt. So this, you can't be definitive, but this feels like it's probably a bird that's 5 years old or more. So it's really cool when you see this, even if you're not going to put it down as an age code. Lucy, stop. I might have to bribe my bird. And the tail on this one, it's weird. It's not symmetric. There's an old one there. There's an old one there. It may be the randomness of an older bird. It could also be that one of these feathers, because I was thinking this looks really crisp and new. I bet this one is on the verge of molting. Maybe this one got knocked out, by a bunny that was trying to escape and thus grew in at a different time. So it's fading out of sequence. Okay, told you we'd talk about accipiters a little bit. Um, Shannon talked a bit about the second year birds, and you occasionally see retained flight feathers, but mostly you're going to age them by finding back and shoulder and rump feathers. There'll be brown juvenile feathers, and they'll often show a little rusty fringe. Sometimes the fringe wears away and the edges of the feathers almost take on a bracket shape, excuse me, because the shaft of the feather doesn't wear as fast as the fringy stuff. So you'll get a long shaft with like weird short fringe. I don't know how to do that. There. Anyway, this bird does not have that. It can be difficult on accipiters, especially female accipiters, because as you can see, this is her adult plumage here. This stuff is fresh. It's nice and dark, but we think of gray-backed accipiters, but look how warm a gray that is. It really is just kind of a blackish brown, not a gray so much. So when this very dark blackish brown fades, it becomes a lighter brown. But what you see is the shape, and it's a little bit hard to see the shape of these brown feathers that have stayed around. It's still a good big rounded feather. It doesn't have that brackety thing going on. It's not showing a rufous fringe. So when you see brown feathers like this, and they stand out in my mind a little bit more on male coops just because they have that steely gray. But when you see these old brown feathers mixed in with the new brown feathers, then you've got an after second year accipiter. And while it's true that older accipiters have darker eyes in general, it happens at kind of an uneven rate of change. It happens faster in smaller birds. So male Sharpies get their bright red eyes within just a few years. Some female coops can be 7 or 8 years old and still not have really dark red eyes. So it cannot be used reliably to confirm age, but as I note, it's very cool to look at. Falcons. There's my little falcon back there. They do not follow the same molt pattern as other raptors we commonly work with. They're closely related to parrots, and the two families share a similar molt strategy. That's what they call the patterns of molt. It's known as a molt strategy, which I think is kind of bizarre, but there you go. Their molt starts in the center of the primaries and in the center of the secondaries and moves outward. So this is a newer feather that I'm guessing is probably about P6, maybe 7. And then these are kind of trashed. They're waiting to get replaced. And they're going inward, and you can just barely see the low number primaries, but you can see that sort of brownish color there. In the secondaries, there's this jet black, like number 4. And then everything else here is waiting its turn to start molting out that way and molting this way. They normally do a complete molt every year. When you think of the demands that falcons place on their plumage at their speeds, it makes sense that they've got to get it all replaced and in perfect condition. So I'm going to say any questions at this point, but I do have a few more slides to share if you'd like. But are there any questions on that part?
Yes, we've got a couple of questions, Siobhan. First, Emily asked, do all birds follow the same or molt similarly? And
if you mean, no, there are some large kind of general patterns, but like the way passerines molt is different than the way these guys do. And I could not absolutely tell you how passerin molt goes to save my life, but I know that there's a lot that has to do with when the wing coverts molt and stuff is a big deal. Ducks, for the most part, drop all their flight feathers at once. And they go into a very cryptic body plumage and just sit on the water for safety while it's happening. And that cryptic plumage is called eclipse plumage, but they're essentially flightless. And I think that's where the expression sitting duck came from. I mean, because they really are, I mean, seriously, they are defenseless and they're just sitting there on the water. And fortunately, they can sit on the water because a lot of predators won't swim out after them. So that's good. And, you know, there are other families of birds that do use the same molt pattern as the raptors, I think. And I could be wrong about this because I'm wrong about a lot of things. But I think like the herons and stuff, larger birds will use this molt pattern because they can't afford to have a whole lot of feathers missing in one part of their wing at once. When you look at what happens in the secondaries during the first molt and then in the primaries during subsequent molts, there are little gaps, but they also kind of allow the adjoining feathers to overlap it. So you lose a little bit of your strength there, but not all of it. Whereas with the little birds, where it's kind of going out through the whole wing at once, they'll have some larger gaps, but they can manage.
Siobhan, from Robert, he asks, do we ever look at the coverts to help provide more insight to the primaries and secondaries?
That's kind of a yes, but answer. We used to emphasize it more, but my husband is arriving home. My birds are going to get very excited, so it might get noisy for a minute. Anyway, the coverts do molt. I'm going to bribe her. Okay, keep talking. They molt at roughly the same time as the primaries and secondaries that they're associated with, but not exactly at the same time. Sometimes before, sometimes after. And so I guess the main thing about it would be if you have a place where you're missing a feather in the count and you're like, God, there's a missing feather here someplace. Maybe if you're looking at the secondary coverts and you see where there's a wave and a gap and an edge, that might guide you to look for a missing feather there. But it's kind of like eye color. It can confirm something that you're seeing. It can back up an observation that you're making, but it's mostly just kind of a cool thing to look at.
Excellent. Haley asks, is it typically asymmetric replacement?
It's typically fairly symmetric, but there can be, I mean, it's not shocking to have asymmetry, but in general, the patterns are going to be fairly symmetric, and the design is symmetric, for lack of a better way to say it.
Excellent. Emily asks, how did Siobhan learn all of this? Just by experience?
I wish I experienced quite so many adults as this. Partly it's like looking at pictures of birds I've banded kind of obsessively and trying, because I draw them, so I'm looking closely at them and trying to make sense of some of the things I was seeing. I had the benefit of, for like 20 years, 20 years, doing Townsley one day a week, and I got to pick Buzz's brain for very, very many mornings. And then the process of doing the book with Peter, I saw things about molt in other species that helped me understand raptor molt better. There's some things about feather shapes and stuff like that that I'm not going to get into, but Beth knows what I'm talking about.
Last question, Siobhan, and then we will go through the rest of your pictures and people can keep throwing questions out. Perry asks, and I'm going to say this wrong, Perry, and I apologize. If an adventitious feather is created, does the bird consider that it has already molted that feather and so skip it next time? How does it decide it is time to re-include that one in a wave?
That's an excellent question, which is, I was taught lo these many years ago, the proper scientific way to say, I don't know. I'm not sure anybody knows. And I think it probably, we're going to get the whole symphony right now. There's probably a factor of how recently the lost feather had already molted. Like, if this one gets replaced just a month earlier than it would have normally, the bird will probably hold on to it. Why waste the energy? If it had been lost, 2 months after it molted originally, it's almost time for it. It'll probably get back into its own cycle. And again, when you get into wing and tail feathers, those don't get replaced every year anyway. So I would say it's probably more likely that it gets held over, but I think it just depends a little bit on the timing of the loss.
All right, Siobhan, that's all we've got in the chat so far. So hit us with some more pictures.
Okay. So remember I said falcons molt almost completely. Mark McCausland, if you're here, tell me if you recognize that bird and whose blood is trickling down its legs. This is an adult peregrine banded just a few weeks ago by Craig Nikitas and Mark McCausland. What's really cool about this, Mark texted me, they aged it as hatch year and then started after hatch year, excuse me. They aged it as after hatch year and then wondered if they could get more specific. But when you look at this bird, that is some really sweet, clean molt going on there. Oops, not that. And you see a growing number 10 primary. And there might be a growing number 1, I can't remember. And then this is actually a secondary. You can see that it's curving back toward the body. And that one's still growing. Over here, you've got another growing number 10, but all the rest of this stuff here is new. All of this is new. All of this is new. All of this is new. So this bird, that's a very complete molt and just very little to go on. All that you can see is new adult. So as much as it would be really satisfying to age this bird more specifically, just because you always want to do everything perfect for your peregrines, after hatch year is the correct call because there's just nothing to point to say whether it was a kid or an adult last year. But it can come back and visit anytime it wants to. Mark, if you're there and you have anything to add or not. Okay.
So Mark actually says, sorry, Siobhan, it just came through. That bird was already banded. It was a foreign recovery.
Do we know how old it was? Did we find out from the recovery yet?
Mark, do you want to unmute and just explain or talk about your amazing bird?
We don't know yet.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we'll find out shortly.
Cool. I want to be on the list to know.
You'll be on the list, definitely.
All right. Okay.
That was not my blood.
No. That's why I named him Nikitas, because I figured people's powers of deductive reasoning, that's what Molt is all about is deductive reasoning. So, you got to work on it in every way you can. Okay, this wing is fascinating to me. This is from Nancy Morey, and I think she was with Ashley banding this just like 2-3 weeks ago. This is a second year bird, but it's very complete molt. This feather grew in a little funny, but it's an adult pattern. This one is still growing. This is brand new, still slightly growing, but it's adult pattern. They have this wider subterminal band on them. These primaries, are all nice and grown in, and just these last two are retained. And this came up once during the talk with Shannon last week. One of the sources she was talking about or something mentioned the clear inner web on the outer primaries on juvenile feathers. This is what it is, because on adult birds, they tend to get more heavily marked there. It's not 100%, but if you looked at this wing from below, you would see a very distinctly different pattern between this number 8 and the 9 and 10 next to it. Then the other wing, now you can see some old kind of messy retained juvenile feathers still up here in the coverts. And I think it was Robert that was asking about, do retained coverts tell you anything? Here you can kind of see they pretty much match what's going on with the primaries and secondaries. But anyway, this is the other wing. And again, these two slightly more worn outer primaries. And then down here, there is one retained secondary that is definitely a juvenile feather. It is noticeably shorter. It's got this narrower pattern on it. It's got, heavier wear. It's really, really subtle. And this one here, like this shorter feather here, this is a good point of comparison. This is the number 4 secondary. This is the last one in its molt tract. And it is still growing in, but you can see it's got the wider, smudgier sort of subterminal band. And then you go 5, 6, 7, 8. These are all new. But then this tract here, number 9, didn't quite get molted. So this one, to me, this is a really cool bird because it's just not that often that you see a second year bird that has got such a very complete molt. So she did not miss many meals last year.
All right, Siobhan, we have a question from Alan.
Okay.
And this is, I'm apologizing ahead of time.
Okay.
If an adventitious isn't advantageous, can the advent of its adventure assure an advocation in avocados?
I'm allergic to avocados. I'm not touching that question. Okay, saved by the bell by the last word. Okay, so those were 2 really clean birds there, right? Really clean molt. I want to show you it runs the spectrum. Now, the thing to consider is this is a summer bird. It's a bird that Ben Dudek trapped at SFO, where they try to clear them off the runways and keep them out of trouble. But look at the mess. Look at this bird. Everything is getting replaced, and thank God, because look how trashed some of this stuff is. Some of these older feathers are looking good, but this kind of thing, I think you'd probably feel pretty comfortable calling that very old. Same in the tail, you're seeing this stuff, it's basically losing the little black subterminal band because it's so fringed out at this point. This is one of these, this is going to be pure idle speculation on my part. So this is not gospel or anything. But when I looked at this, it really made me wonder if this is a bird, you know, it's on the peninsula. Maybe it was affected by some of the fires around the Bay Area last year, which hit toward the end of summer. It would have been, you know, kids are fledged, it's time for me to molt, but right when she needs the energy to start molting and replacing her feathers, instead she's got to take off, find a new place, you know, learn the ins and outs of hunting a new area because her house over, you know, in Davenport is gone now. And so you see something like this and you think, how did it get to be such a mess? It really looks like this bird could not replace much of what was going on last year. That's my idle speculation story. But, you know, it's things to think about when you see a bird, and it's obviously still thriving. Ben said she was huge and well fed, and she's got enough energy to grow a lot of new feathers this year. So, you know, whatever bad thing was happening last year, she seems to be doing just fine now. But we won't see them this messy because this is really a summertime thing, usually. Okay. I think I've got one or two. Oh yeah, I do have one or two more. This is a really cool thing that I've seen a few times, and actually you might have noticed it on that juvenile bird that I had at the very beginning. Really new feathers sometimes have this iridescent sheen on them. And you can see this bird has some old feathers still retained in its shoulders among these new feathers, and that sheen wears off. But when you see it, it's really cool. It's usually not this pronounced, but it's just one more thing to look for when you're trying to figure out new and old feathers. If you see this feather in the middle of all these shiny things, you go, okay, that's old. Not that we're recording shoulder coverts on red tails, but, and I don't know, I don't think I've ever seen this on an exhibitor. It might just be a red tail thing or a buteo thing, but I have seen it on several red tails, both juveniles and adults, and it's super cool. And that's why molt is great, because you see super cool things. And that's the end. Okay. I'm going to stop sharing unless anybody has anything they want to go back to. The silence is deafening. Hi.
Siobhan, this is Mary, and Carol, it looks like your question went directly to me, but let me just read it. How does smoke and particle respiration affect feather growth? You kind of touched on it, or maybe we don't know that much about it, but
I don't know anything about that. I think what I was talking about with being affected by fires, it is more that they lose access to their reliable hunting. And it's been touched on in all of these workshops, but molt and feather replacement is really energy intensive. And if they don't have, you know, I mean, that's one of the reasons why it's a marker for fitness. Breeding fitness is like, if you can have a really gorgeous set of feathers, it means you have a food source that's reliable enough that you can afford to grow some gorgeous feathers. So if you're in a situation where the food supply is not as good or interrupted, that's where oh, he took away my picture, sorry. I'd have to go back. But that's where you get things like fault bars, you know, like birds all of a sudden not being able to hunt for a few days while a feather is growing means you're going to get a little wave in there in the shaft of the feather, in the vein of the feather, where the feather growth was not as good because there just wasn't the same energy to produce. So that's why I say things like fires, I have to wonder if juvenile birds coming from the Pacific Northwest this year are going to show some fault bars as a result of that heat wave that was up there, which, maybe some of those kids were still growing their feathers at the time that happened. And I think that could have very well affected them by stressing them. Again, molt is useful for idle conversation in the blind when things are slow, or maybe when things are slow on the hill, or when you're still driving to get out to Solano and you've got another hour in the car, you can talk about some cool thing you saw in molt.
Siobhan, Alan asks if you've, all right, hold on. Woo, we're getting more questions coming through. Have you, and everyone, just a reminder, in 5 minutes, it will be, please feel free to head out. At 58, I will remind everyone of our next talk, but Siobhan, Mary, would it be okay if we held it open? If people would like to stay to keep talking to Siobhan?
If Siobhan is
Yeah, I'm
up for it, I'm fine too.
Yeah,
Okay.
sure, whatever. Okay.
Okay,
So there
so
started to be a question.
so Alan asks, have you ever noted energetic nutritional cause differentiations in your parrots' feathers, or otherwise learned about molt from the kids at home?
Yes, I have learned about molt from the kids at home, and a couple different ways. I not so much nutrition stuff, because they get a pretty consistent diet. I have seen them damage feathers growing in by energetic play, so they get some weird things. Lucy, the little super screechy one, who's super cute, I can bring her over so you can see her. Lucy is actually a rescue, and her feather condition when we first got her was not as good. And she had been fed a very limited, not super great diet. We got her eating good food, and just a more active bird, so she took more interest in preening and stuff like that. So I actually did see the difference diet makes in her case, because she had not the best stuff before she came to us. The other thing is, I notice daylight exposure to daylight makes a difference. And both Lucy and our sun conure Kodachrome have really brilliant plumage. If they're not getting enough sunlight, the colors, oddly, sun fades the feathers, but it also intensifies the colors when the feathers are growing, so they get healthier colors. I'm not saying that well, but anyway, there you go. Wait, you're quiet. You're muted, Beth.
So just a reminder, everyone, on November 9th, we're going to take a week off. November 9th, Alan Fish is going to come back, and he's going to talk to us about seeing raptor molt in flight. So take a look, make sure you watch out for that invitation, and think of tongue twister questions for Alan for November 9th. And I'm going to toss it back to Siobhan.
And whoever's got a question. Or maybe nobody does.
We did have one. From Catherine. Does your experience banding and learning about molt help you when you're watching hawks in the sky or perched?
I'll sort of say yes. It's I don't think it does a lot to help me like identify things, but it is cool to be able to pick out the molt, especially because you can really see second year molt in flight. So it it helps in the sense that it makes something that's fun even more fun. So you can see that and you go, oh, that kid's from last year. Or there's a thing with turkey vultures that they can, I don't want to say they synchronize, but they really do kind of do their molt at the same time, and kind of at the same rate. And I still remember, I think Ann Ardilla was part of this and a few other GGRO people going out birding with Peter Pyle in West Marin. And he was just noting all of the turkey vultures were missing P4. And at the end, and he's just like, see, P4. At the end of the day, we ended up at the Marconi Center up in Marshall, and it turned out that there was a big TV roost on the grounds. And as we were walking through the grounds, we started finding feathers on the ground. And Peter held up one and he's like, look, P4. And then we just looked and there were P4s everywhere. And it was it made the day more fun. And having an understanding of molt definitely made that moment just stick. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but
I'm going to toss one out. I'm also going to toss Mark's out. Tackle mine after Mark's. Mark asked, do turkey vultures have Staffelmauser pattern? And I want to know if you can think of a molt project that might involve both the hawk watchers and the banders, both taking data on molt for some birds. First, Staffelmauser.
I think turkey vulture, I got to tell you, I haven't obsessed about them as much because I know I'm not going to have one in hand. I think it's essentially a similar pattern, but I'd really have to look in the secondaries. And I think they also do kind of a more complete molt of the primaries. But again, I don't want to say for sure without looking it up. So there's that. Sorry, Mark. But Pile Guide Volume 2 would have that information. Copies on sale today. Gosh, it would be fun to have a molt project that they could both work on, but I don't know. Alan, do you have an idea? He's asleep. He's trying to get an idea for his talk.
No, I'm definitely taking lots of notes. You're so entertaining. There's some great lines, and you've given me a lot to work with next week, which will be taking everything you guys have done and trying to apply it to birds in flight watching. So, but yeah, I don't have anything obviously in mind, but I think what we're doing is opening up everybody's brains to just what you said, the deeper opportunity to look up at a bird quickly and evaluate where it might be in its molt cycle. So, as well as the seasonality, that's one of the things that I feel like we're really naive about is the seasonality of molt. I seem to remember Jack Dumbacher was working on a sort of cycle of vulture molt study 10, 15 years when he first came to Cal Academy. And really that's the beauty of it. We could do some wonderful year-round observations of where birds are in molt, like just away from Hawkville, away from the headlands, because of course most of it's happening in spring and summer anyway. I'm really fascinated by the weirdo birds like harriers and Elanus kites, the whitetails, because they're so poorly studied and they're such left field Accipidridae birds. So again, one of the things I think about is what are the weird studies, what are the obscure birds that we don't know much about? And could we focus on those even if it weren't a fall migration deal?
Yeah, I think the one thing you can do is I think you guys could definitely ID or pull second year birds out from older birds in flight, just because that wing on a soaring bird. Because I've seen
Red
that,
tails.
on red tails, seen that in the field many times. It's really, really obvious. And I feel like if people could actually get those second year IDs, it could give you some ideas about survivorship, and is it recruitment? Is that the word I'm trying to look for?
Yeah.
I mean, I always remember I guess it was in Silent Spring, like one of the signs of trouble at Hawk Mountain was that they were seeing adult birds flying by, but they were no longer seeing kids. And so that's how they knew that there was an issue with, breeding success, and eggs weren't hatching and stuff like that. If we had a long-term understanding of the proportion of second year to other ones, and it's kind of a hard one to really get a hard number on, but then I think that could give you trend lines, like, okay, they make it to the second year, but then there's something you might be able to do with it, but I don't know what the question is to ask yet.
Yeah.
Do you want to tackle another question?
Sure.
Okay, Carol asks, are TV turkey vultures the only species that molt in community molting like that, what you described with Peter?
And I don't even know that I would call it community. It's just that they have communal roosts, and their molt timing is kind of similar, but I bet if, oh shoot, excuse me, my darling nephew, but I got to decline the call right now. Anyway, if you went to a place where there was a roost of a parrot flock, or out at the Farallones, you'd probably also see Western gull primary number 8, everywhere for about a week. I mean, does that make sense? I think it's more a function of them being in a communal roosting situation, and just coincidentally, they probably track pretty closely on their molt. That's all. And maybe that's a function of being driven by something different, like daylight hours or whatever. Maybe turkey vultures have more consistent nutrition, so they can keep a schedule better than a red tail. I got no idea. Molt is fun because it gives you so many questions you can ask. Okay.
All right, that's it at the moment.
Okay,
Does
that's
anyone have a burning desire molt question? All right, Siobhan, I'm just going to say that was amazing talk. Take a look at the chat. There is all sorts of congratulations and thank yous throughout the entire chat. And thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your time with us.
And anytime anybody has an hour or two to spare and wants to hear more, you just let me know.
Pop up Molt Academy.
There you go. Okay, cool. Well, thank you everybody for coming, and I hope you picked up some of it. It gets esoteric. Wait, can I mention one more thing?
What'd you say, Siobhan?
Can I mention one more thing? I meant to talk about it. I forgot. The breeding suspension. What happens with like a lot of red tails and stuff like that is they start to molt like February, March, something like that. And they can actually do some molting while they're sitting on a nest, sitting on eggs, because there's not a lot going on. And then they got kids to feed and got a lot of hunting to do, and they're really busy for about 2-3 months. So they hold off on molting because they don't have the energy to do it. And then they pick up again. And there'll be a gap in the sort of gentle age progression there of a couple months. And so sometimes it can make you puzzle a little bit, like, is this last year's feather, or is it just one that they did right at the start of the season and then suspended because they were breeding? So one more question to ask. That's a Bander question. When you're looking at one, then you can sit there and try to figure out those sort of considerations you have to take. That's all.
Thank you so much, Siobhan.
You're welcome. Thanks
Yep,
for letting me talk about my favorite topic.
Fabulous. Thank you, Siobhan. Thanks,
Okay.
everybody.
Okay, bye. Okay.